Sorry for the technical difficulty there. This is the second half of Lecture 24 on Gothic architecture in France, loading some of the panoramic 360-degree views. I think froze up my browser last time, so we'll continue where it cut off, which was our discussion of Amion Cathedral. This is a case where we know the names of the architects, Robert de Luzarches, Thomas, and Renaud de Clermont, and the style is definitely high Gothic. You can tell that from, of course, the pointed arches, the very deeply recessed portals, which have an enormous amount of sculptural detail in them. You can very clearly see flying buttresses on the nave in particular. You can also see a tower at the crossing point, a pretty imposing set of towers on the front of the church, but probably the most prominent change here really is in this elaboration on the King's Gallery. This is often a sculptural band of almost freestanding relief sculptures, usually larger than life size, obviously, but these are much, much larger than in previous churches. These are frequently the ancestors of Christ. They sometimes serve as what is known as a tree of Jesse, a family tree. They, though, can sometimes be replaced by images of members of the royal family, showing the ascension of kings. So we're seeing a much larger King's Gallery in this particular church. So Ameon Cathedral has some outstanding features. You definitely want to be able to recognize these. The towers at the west facade, of course, the elaborate portal, deeply recessed entrances, very large sculptures, a large rose window that has more of the tracery effect as opposed to the large spacing of stonework in between that we call the plate window style. The large sculptures underneath that in the King's Gallery, the flying buttresses along the nave, certainly. Within the building, we have ribbed vaulting, quadripartite vaults that span a single bay each, and of course the pointed arches. Within the interior, you're looking at an elevation of three parts: nave arcade, triforium, and clerestory, and we're looking at a nave that is 144 feet in height, which makes it roughly, what, 30 feet higher than the church that we were just discussing prior to the computer failure there, the Cathedral of Chartres. I want to pull up some examples for you of the interior of this building. So if you'll just bear with me, let me change screens. And this takes us to the interior of Amion Cathedral. First, I want to just pan up so that we can see some of the sculpture, and if we really tilt it, you can see how deeply recessed it is. You can even see the gargoyles hanging off the front of the building. You can see all of these angelic figures surrounding the tympan sculpture, which is Christ's judgment, although we see him more as Christ in the second coming. We see a little bit less of the violence there. There are judging of souls. You certainly can see the damned here and the saved to the side, and a figure of Christ that really starts to feel more like fully three-dimensional sculptural form that looks a lot like what we saw in ancient Rome. You can certainly see that happening here. Some of the figures of the months of the year, the labors taking place at different points of the year, also make the function of the building somewhat secular in terms of the exterior. Let's go inside. And here we are in the nave facing the apse, facing the altar. And if we tilt a little and raise our point of view here, you can see the nave arcade is really high, which allows for windows to allow light straight through the side aisle. So that's definitely a new feature of that Gothic, is that we have more light inside. We have the triforium above, and we've got the bright clerestory above that. If we look directly at the vaulting, in between two piers, of course, is a bay. We have a transverse rib here and diagonal ribs here, so that divides the bay into 1, 2, 3, 4 units, quadripartite vaulting system. And it really does make the building feel much, much taller. It's all about verticality and height, especially here in the High Gothic style. Sculpture on the outside, we just looked at a couple of the examples of the laborers and the zodiac signs. Here's the portal on the front, and you can see this is where we entered, right? So there's the figure of Christ, there's Christ in the second coming. This panel is Saints and Prophets. The center panel is Christ in the second coming, and this panel on this portal is dedicated to the Virgin. So if we zoom in on that, you can see the birth of Jesus, you can see the death of the Virgin, and you can also see above Mary crowned as Queen of Heaven. So a pretty important image there. And then a little bit closer head-on view of the second coming, and there you can see what I was referencing earlier, the damned being pushed to the side by some demons and the blessed being led away by the saved. There's the Christ as the beautiful God as the central Trumeau sculpture in the center of the portal, and this is the Trumeau on the Mary side. She's known as the Gilded Virgin, and and you can see that it is slightly still retaining the gold and a little bit of the paintwork. So you can imagine that even through the Middle Ages would be painting sculpture. Amion Cathedral I thought you'd really like because it is a good example of how we're getting into a more elaborate style, the Rayonnant style. And you can see here that one of the things that happens in the Rayonnant style is trying to get rid of as much stone as possible and replace it with glass. So our tympanum sculpture above the portals is now replaced with these glorious glass windows, an enormous rose window. And here the King's Gallery, even bigger than what we just saw and raised above the rose window. So it's really becoming impressive, imposing, very high relief figural sculpture. So definitely the architecture is kind of intriguing too. The surrounds of the architrave around the where the tympanum portal sculpture would normally be, we've got sculpture in the space above the architrave and with architectural elements above that that almost block the rose window from your sight on the ground. It's very much an elaborate style. And on the interior, you can see how wonderful that double effect of this is where the back of the sculpture would have been, essentially, and where the rose window is. This whole structure is all about this vertical height and the three-part elevation of the High Gothic. You can see a little bit better view here of how deep these recessed areas are, and you can see that a lot of the sculpture attention is on the jamb figures, the figures that are in essentially the door jambs. And if we zoom in on those, you can really see that one of the intriguing things about the construction of a cathedral is that it could take decades. You could have not only multiple artisans working on it, but so much time could pass, the styles of those individual artisans could change. At first glance, you may not notice it, but if you really divide this image in half, the figures on the left, the two on the left, the Annunciation figures, versus the two figures of the Visitation scene, almost feel like they're from two different time periods and certainly two different styles. The Visitation figures really feel like they harken back to the wet drapery, quote-unquote, technique that we saw in the High Classical era and into the Hellenic ancient Greece, and their bodies are in contrapposto poses, and it really looks as though the drapery is responding to the figure underneath. And you can even see the specifics in the face. The aging is really definitely more expressive and more like what we came to be used to in the Roman imperial period. One of the most beautiful small churches that we can look at is Sainte-Chapelle. It is the chapel specifically for the kings, and in fact it was part of a much larger building complex, not a lot of it still exists. There's been a lot of buildings damaged, torn down, redesigned, but it is on the opposite end, basically, of that small island in the river in the middle of Paris. Over here, you've got Notre Dame de Paris, and over here you have the location of Sainte-Chapelle. So you can imagine that the king's palace was here, and this was essentially the church specifically for the king. And in fact, this particular chapel holds a very important relic. It is the home of the crown of thorns, and so it is a really important but relatively small church. It has some unique features. We don't really have flying buttresses here. We have the vertical buttresses or piers right slap against the wall, allowing there to be enormously tall, almost entirely glass wall windows. The windows are about 49 feet in height, an enormous rose window, and this unique double portico feature is there also. Some modest towers at the front and a tower essentially over what is quote-unquote the crossing. There is another portal here. It's rather small, and so it almost acts as a crossing. You can see here sort of a transept, but it's not got side aisles. It's a rather unique single space. The elevation inside is pretty basic. It's got a small nave arcade and then this enormous clerestory. We do have this section of divisions here with ribbed vaults, pointed arches. So the features to look for: those very small towers at the west, double porch or double portico, pointed tower essentially over what would be the crossing, although it's very minimal, vertical buttresses rather than the flying buttresses and piers, ribbed vaults. We've got quadripartite vaults in essence, dividing the sections using pointed arches, essentially only a nave arcade and a clerestory in this form. I do want to take you to the inside of this, though, so let me change screens once again. And this will take us right into Sainte-Chapelle. So the light is coming through the building on the wall behind us from this point of view. But imagine this is essentially 50 feet of glass all the way around. You can see that the ribbing divides the bay into 4 sections. 1, 2, 3, 4. You can see that the ceiling mimics that kind of blue field with golden stars that we saw in some of the Eastern Orthodox tradition. And it's not a very long chapel. But you get a sense of how intense the light is coming through. And if we scan down, you get a sense of how big it really is. So this is definitely not on the scale of something like Amion, but still an incredible example of that Rana style and the impressive, essentially dissolving of the stone and replacing it with glass that is the hallmark of that style. Really a beautiful, glorious church. I also wanted us to have a look at the next big phase of architectural development. After the Renan style, we have the Flamboyant style. So if you thought that Sainte-Chapelle or the church at Reims was too much, that we had too much going on, now we have even more than that. This is one of the most over-decorated churches in its exterior that I can possibly show you. It is absolutely covered with flying buttresses and with statuary and tracery carving that's been perforated so you can see through it. We'll look at that in a moment. But the main feature really that draws my attention is the portal. We're used to having 3 doors across, a main portal in the center that equates with the nave, and then doors on either side that equate to the side aisles. But here we actually end up with 5 entrances, or at least the facade seems to have 5. The ones on the extreme ends are actually false entrances. They just continue this architectural style around a slightly curved front facade, which is very, very unusual. You really can see the intricacy of the carving when we get a little bit closer to it. I want to show you the interior of the building now. Let's switch over to our interior view. This puts us basically in the transept, or in the crossing. Take a little second for it to load. There we go. You can look up. You can see a three-part elevation very clearly: nave arcade, decorative triforium, and clerestory above that. Some radiating chapels as well there at the end. We're essentially in the crossing right now, and then turning around to look back down the nave toward the rose window at the entrance. You can see those really dramatic compound piers dividing the ceiling into, just within one bay, quadripartite vaulted. Pretty impressive church there. See in more detail the exterior. We can get even a little bit closer and you can see that tracery work. So there's our entrance portal with the traditional stir in it, and now we've got this architectural detailing that almost obscures the rose window from the outside, and it continues. It's perforated, you can see through it, continues on the other four entrances. Obviously this one's obscured by a tree. Sculpture at the pinnacle of it, I mean, it's almost too much to be believed. There is carving and decorative stonework everywhere. There's pinnacles. Any place that you could put something decorative, it has been added there. So St. McLeod becomes a pretty remarkable church, I think, in a lot of ways. A great example for us of the flamboyant style. So things to look for there: pointed tower at the crossing, very obviously elaborate and curved portal with its 5 quote-unquote 5 entrances, 3 real, 2 false on the ends. Ribbed vaults that divide the vaulting system into quadripartite sections, pointed arches, of course, as well. And I just wanted to close out the Gothic section in France by briefly showing some examples that the textbook discusses, such as one of the few existing Gothic medieval towns that exist in France. This particular example shows you what a walled town would have looked like. In fact, it has a double wall, and the interior includes a keep castle. It's a definite way to fortify and protect the people of a region. So you can still imagine that to some extent this is not a unified single country. The people are still more or less loyal to a region or a smaller place. We can also see the to some extent of a middle class or a working class beginning here in the Gothic era and moving into the Renaissance with the rise of the guilds. Now, a guild is essentially like a trade union in a way. Its membership is made up of people who all practice the same profession, but it also acts as a governing body, as a body that oversees the rules, regulations, sets prices, and it determines membership within a particular profession. So you wouldn't be able to have a successful career in a given profession if you were not able to gain membership within the guild, and the guild would then help to set prices and try to regulate the business. So what you're looking at is not a church or a private home, but it's a building for commerce. We do have architecture for private homes in the Gothic style, especially for the ultra-wealthy. Jacques Coeur was not only involved in banking, he had banking offices throughout the entirety of France, but he also involved in shipping and other business ventures. He did eventually start to offend people because of his massive amount of wealth, but he did spend quite a bit of it on this private residence, essentially in the flamboyant style for a private home. We also looked at some examples of manuscript illumination, and of course we're in France, so it makes sense that we would see a connection to the Carolingian and especially Ottonian styles that had begun here in this territory when it was part of the Holy Roman Empire. So dividing the scene into sections is somewhat similar to what we saw in the Ottonian. We also see a lot of heavy use of gold leaf that we've seen from the Ottonian style as well. You see that here also. Again, not as much attention to accuracy in proportion or anatomy. The Psalter that you see here may well have been designed and executed by the same artist who did the stained glass at Sainte-Chapelle, which is pretty impressive. The piece to know for the purposes of the test is by the illustrator known as Master Honor. This is page folio 7, the verso side of folio 7 from the breviary of Philip le Bel, and it shows scenes related to David and Goliath. The scene at the bottom shows David with the sling ready to do battle with the giant. You see Goliath here, and then you immediately see Goliath defeated. He has got the wound, and here's David beheading him. He's even kind of grasping the head ahead of time, like as if he knows that's what's going to take him down. But what I find really remarkable about this in particular is the way the highlight and shadow is painted on the figure of David. The proportions are not perfect, but the highlight and shadow is starting to make these figures look and feel much more fully three-dimensionally believable. So we really are here in the year 1800 headed into the beginnings of the Renaissance. You can see the same kind of thing happening here in the modeling of the fabric and the Annunciation scene in this Book of Hours. That really gives us a highlight and shadow that starts to make the figures more fully three-dimensional. Now, they don't fit the architecture. They're too large for the building, obviously, but you do get a sense of more solidity at this point. We also have a pretty intriguing artist, Viard d'Ancourt, who is a master mason. He does work with architecture and stone carving, masonry work, but he also starts doing these drawings for himself. This is a private sketchbook as opposed to a Book of Hours or a breviary or a lectionary or a book of Gospels. What you see here is the application of geometric forms to drawings of things like animals and especially human faces. It's as though he's trying to work out a system for proportion and for the placement of the features of the face. It's not, of course, the perfect proportions we became used to in Greece and Rome, but it is an attempt to get there. And you can see him working on getting the face into a geometric pattern. You can certainly see his fanciful work in imagining what creatures might look like. The lion is a pretty remarkable drawing, sort of human-ish and porcupine-ish combined. And I really like his designs for these figures that are combining floral and plant motifs with human faces. It feels like it does owe something back to the Celtic tradition of interlacing that we saw in the Hiberno-Saxon tradition, sort of that illustration tradition that came from Lindisfarne and then distributed throughout the British Isles. Certainly you can see the influence of French architects in other places. So just to close it out, I wanted you to just briefly have a look at some examples of architecture by French architects in places elsewhere within Europe. This is a piece in Germany, a church in Lyon, Spain. It certainly looks French on the interior, and definitely Gothic, three-part elevation, ribbed vaulting, very easy to recognize those elements. And here again, a cathedral at Prague that also on the interior absolutely feels like it's married some of the language of French architecture with perhaps a little influence from England as well.